We live in a world where people often mistake peace for passivity, especially in love and heartbreak. There's this idea that silence means weakness, that calm means you've given up, but nothing could be further from the truth. True peace, the kind that radiates from deep self-worth, isn't a surrender. It's a statement. It's a power move. It's the quiet confidence that says, you no longer have access to the part of me you once disrupted. And when someone plays games, manipulates, or takes your presence for granted, nothing breaks them more than realizing they no longer have the ability to shake your world. Not because you don't feel anything, but because you've chosen not to let their chaos live inside you. In this speech, we're not talking about revenge through anger. We're talking about the kind of revenge that comes through growth, through grace, through peace. Because when you learn to master your emotions instead of being mastered by them, you don't just heal, you rise. And in doing so, you become unforgettable. When someone loses you, the first thing they often expect is a reaction. They expect anger, tears, long messages, arguments, questions, because the drama tells them they still have power. Your emotions, to them, are proof that they still matter. And while you're spiraling, they feel significant. So when you don't give them that emotional payoff, when you stay calm, composed, and unmoved, it shakes them. It forces them to confront the reality that they are no longer a center point in your emotional world. And that kind of quiet can be deafening. Peace in this case becomes more powerful than any outburst ever could be. Because it's not just about being silent, it's about being settled. You're not ignoring them to punish them. You're just so rooted in your self-respect that their presence or absence doesn't alter your course. This is why peace breaks someone who tried to manipulate your emotions. It sends a message. I've found something more important than you, me. It's one thing to say those words, but to live them, to walk away without a need for closure, to not chase, to not try to rewrite the ending. That's the kind of self-control that forces them to look in the mirror. And most people don't like what they see when they do. When you stop feeding someone your energy, they start starving, not because they needed you to survive, but because they relied on your reactions to validate their behavior. When you no longer flinch, cry, or fight, they can't find their identity in your pain anymore. And suddenly all the noise they used to drown out their own issues disappears. Your peace becomes a spotlight on their insecurity. There's something magnetic about someone who's calm in the face of chaos. It's unsettling to those who expected control. When a person realizes they can't push your buttons anymore, they begin to realize they never actually had control of you. They only had access to the parts of you that hadn't healed yet. But now, you're not responding out of pain. You're not driven by a need to be understood or to prove your worth. You're driven by something else entirely, alignment. If something doesn't feel right, you step away, not loudly, but firmly. Not to punish them, but to protect your peace. That's the kind of action that lingers. That's the kind of silence they hear at 2 a.m. Letting your peace do the talking isn't about pretending not to care. It's about deciding what deserves your energy, and not everyone does. When you finally understand that someone who plays games with your heart is actually revealing their own lack of emotional maturity, you stop chasing. You stop trying to decode their mixed signals. You stop rehearsing what you'll say if they come back, because you know that the version of you that needed them to understand your value no longer exists. You've outgrown that version. You've moved into a space where you're not trying to win them back. You're focused on winning yourself back. The moment you become peaceful is the moment they lose control, because people don't expect growth, they expect reaction. And growth doesn't yell, it doesn't beg, it doesn't plead, it just moves differently. It glows, it builds, it evolves. And that evolution is what creates the regret. Because now, not only have they lost you, but they've lost the chance to even disturb your waters. And that's what they'll remember. Not the fight, not the final words, but the fact that you didn't need them to collapse, to rise. This kind of peace is cultivated, it's chosen, it's protected. You create it by slowly removing the pieces of your identity that were tied to proving your worth to someone who couldn't see it. You stop seeking explanations. You stop chasing apologies. You stop expecting growth from someone who isn't willing to look inward, and you come home to yourself. that return is what brings the stillness. That stillness is what makes them realize what they've lost. Because now, you're not trying to show them how much they hurt you. You're too busy healing. You're too busy creating a life so grounded in peace that they know, without you ever saying a word, that they'll never get close to you again. Not because you're bitter, but because you've moved beyond the version of yourself who settled for chaos over calm. The moment you stop reacting to someone's games is the moment they realize the power dynamic has shifted. Emotional detachment doesn't mean you've stopped caring altogether. It means you've stopped letting their behavior dictate your mood, your decisions, and your peace of mind. That detachment isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's when you finally see someone for who they've consistently shown themselves to be, not who you hoped they could become. And when you reach that clarity, your emotional world becomes a lot less chaotic and a lot more intentional. You don't respond to every breadcrumb. You don't interpret silence as a mystery you need to solve. You simply observe and adjust. That adjustment, pulling your energy back, can be felt more than anything you could ever say. And that absence, that's what starts to haunt them. We often think someone will notice our worth if we can just explain it right. If we can just get them to see how good we were to them, how much we gave, how deeply we loved. But people don't usually wake up to your value through more noise. They wake up through stillness. When you stop trying to be understood and start focusing on understanding yourself, your energy becomes sacred. That sacred energy, when removed, leaves an undeniable void. And that void isn't created by absence alone, it's created by the quality of the presence that used to be there. When someone loses the consistency of your loyalty, your compassion, your emotional investment, they start to feel the difference between access and connection. They may still have the option to reach out, but they no longer have the same reach into you. People don't change when they're comfortable, they change when something about their environment forces them to face themselves. And there's nothing more confronting than realizing someone who used to react with fire and passion now responds with silence and boundaries. You no longer try to teach them lessons, you let life do that. You don't run back when they throw out a vague emotional hook. You don't entertain the "I miss you" text that comes without changed behavior. You've stopped needing the same cycle to validate that you mattered. And that's what breaks the cycle. That's what forces them to actually sit in the consequences of their choices. When you stop participating in the dance, the music stops playing. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood. People think it's bitterness or apathy, but in truth, it's one of the most loving things you can do for yourself. It means you're no longer willing to sacrifice your peace for someone else's inconsistency. You're no longer mistaking pain for passion. You're no longer attracted to potential. You're invested in reality. And if the reality doesn't bring peace, connection, consistency, then you're okay with walking away. Not because it didn't matter, but because you finally matter to yourself more. And the beautiful irony is that this shift, this pulling back, is when people often start pulling forward. When you were available, when you were trying, when you were always there, they got used to that rhythm. They knew they could drift and you'd fill the gap. But when you stop filling it, they realize they don't know how to hold the space. And in that realization comes regret. Regret that they didn't value you when they had the chance. Regret that they mistook your presence as permanent. Regret that they treated your open heart like a revolving door. Because now that door is closed. Not slammed shut, just respectfully guarded. You can't make someone regret losing you by trying harder. You do it by letting go. You do it by choosing peace over proving yourself. You do it by becoming so emotionally self-sufficient that their absence no longer feels like a wound, it feels like a weight lifted. And that transformation, that's what stays with them. That's what they remember, not the tears, not the conversations, not the drama, but the fact that the storm they created no longer touches you. You're out of reach, not because you're hiding, but because you've risen. When you master your emotional responses, you master the relationship dynamic. So much of what gives someone else power over you isn't what they do, it's how much you let it shake you. When a person knows they can throw you off balance with one cold comment, a delayed reply, or a sudden withdrawal of attention, They know they control your emotional climate. That kind of power is addictive for them and exhausting for you. But the day you decide to stop being emotionally hijacked is the day you reclaim your dignity. This is not about pretending not to care. It's about actually training yourself to care differently, to care more about your peace than their approval, to care more about your own boundaries than their behavior. Because when you stop handing over your emotional thermostat, they can't play hot and cold anymore. What most people don't realize is that silence isn't weak, it's strategic. When someone expects you to beg for answers, defend your worth, or chase clarity, and you do none of those things, they're left to deal with their own guilt, confusion, and consequences. You're no longer giving them the emotional feedback they used to feed on. No arguments, no long texts, no "why are you doing this to me" moments, just calm, distance, space, and that space becomes a mirror that reflects their own emotional immaturity, their avoidance, their carelessness. When you stop reacting, you force them to start reflecting, and that reflection is far more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. There is an elegance in not reacting, a quiet kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. It shows up in the way you no longer entertain games, in the way you hear the same apology, but this time you don't believe it just because it's said with tears, in the way you notice their behavior and simply decide, without drama, that it's not aligned with the love you want to build. That kind of emotional maturity is rare, and when someone loses access to that, they notice, because it's not just your presence they miss, it's the version of themselves they got to be around you, the version that was cared for, uplifted, forgiven. When that's gone, they're left with themselves, and that's often the hardest part. This level of detachment doesn't happen overnight. It happens through heartbreaks that woke you up, through all the times you over-explained, over-apologized, over-gave, through the sleepless nights you spent analyzing texts and wondering if you were the problem. It happens when you finally get tired of carrying the emotional weight for both people, when you realize that real love doesn't require constant explaining. It doesn't leave you confused. It doesn't make you feel like you're always auditioning for a role you've already earned. Emotional power comes from emotional responsibility, from learning that the only reaction you truly need is your decision to walk away from what doesn't feel safe or respectful anymore. There's nothing more attractive or more shocking to someone who expected your old patterns than calm. That doesn't mean you've stopped feeling. It means you've started choosing what's worth feeling for. It means you understand that not every battle deserves your presence, that peace is not passivity but power. And when you begin to embody that kind of energy, everything changes. You respond slower, you observe more, you let them show you who they are without rushing to fill in the gaps with hope. You've traded attachment for awareness, and that awareness becomes your armor. Eventually, the person who played with your emotions will look back and realize they weren't just losing someone who cared, they were losing someone who had self-control, depth, patience, and genuine love. Someone who didn't need them but chose them until they made it impossible to keep choosing them. And that's the kind of regret that lingers. Not because you punished them, but because you didn't, because you simply grew quietly, without the need for revenge or validation. That's how you break someone who thought they had the upper hand. Not with chaos, not with cruelty, but with composure. You don't need to scream to make an impact. You don't need to call someone out to show them what they lost. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply rise, quietly, consistently, and undeniably. When someone has played with your heart, pushed your boundaries, or taken your love for granted, your greatest revenge isn't in showing them rage, it's in showing them results. It's in showing them who you are without them, not out of spite, but out of truth. And truth doesn't need to be shouted, it speaks for itself. When you stop trying to be seen by someone who refused to see you, you start seeing yourself more clearly. You stop performing for someone else's recognition and start performing for your own growth. That shift, when you go from seeking their attention to seeking your expansion, is when everything begins to transform. You show them not by telling them, but by living in a way that reflects the lessons they taught you. The moment you stop looking over your shoulder to see if they're watching, ironically, is often the moment they finally start to pay attention. Because what they used to hold over you, your loyalty, your need for closure, your desire for validation, is gone. And what's left is a version of you they never expected. Not the hurt, desperate version they thought would wait forever, but the grounded, evolved version who moved forward. The reason this is so effective is because people are used to the drama, they're used to the begging, the confrontations, the emotional aftermath. But when you choose peace instead of war, it disarms them. It removes the chaos they've grown comfortable controlling. Instead of spiraling, you get focused. Instead of reacting, you rebuild. Your silence stops being about hurt and starts being about healing. And that healing, it's magnetic. It draws new people, new energy, new purpose into your life, and it reminds the one who lost you just how far you've come since they last had access to you. This isn't about pretending to be happy or successful to make someone jealous. It's about becoming genuinely aligned with a life that no longer includes their toxicity. It's about doing the work, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, so that your joy is real, not curated, because nothing is more confusing to someone who thought they broke you than seeing you flourish without ever having to announce it. That's when it hits them. Not when you post a revenge picture or send a snarky message, but when they see that you didn't just survive, you elevated. Not to prove a point, but because you remembered who you were before they made you doubt it. You take your energy back and reinvest it in your passions, in your friendships, in your peace. You start showing up differently. Not because you're trying to trigger a reaction, but because you've finally outgrown the version of you that settled for less. And when that happens, you radiate something different. You walk into rooms with a lighter energy, a calmer presence. You speak less, but your actions speak volume. You no longer need to convince anyone of your worth because your life reflects it. And when the person who played you realizes they've been erased from that picture, not with anger, but with grace, it stings deeper than any insult could. This kind of power isn't loud, but it's unforgettable because it leaves no cracks for re-entry. When you glow without grudge, you close the door in the most final way possible, not by slamming it, but by building something beautiful on the other side, something they're no longer welcome in. And that absence becomes their echo. They might try to reach out. They might try to revisit, but they'll be met with peace, not pain, with detachment, not desperation, with someone who once loved deeply, but now loves wisely. That's what breaks them, not the drama, not the confrontation, but the undeniable proof that they were never needed for you to become who you are now. They were merely the catalyst. And now that they've served their purpose, the story moves on. Without them, without noise, just growth, just peace. And that peace, ironically, is the one thing they can't touch, can't fake, and can't follow. It's yours, fully, finally. There's a moment in healing where you stop caring about proving your worth to someone who didn't see it the first time. That moment is liberation, because it means you've stopped trying to go back and rewrite the story. You've stopped clinging to the hope that they'll finally say the words you wanted to hear. Instead, you've decided to say them to yourself. And what you say now isn't, "Why wasn't I enough?" It's, "I was always enough, and they just weren't capable of seeing it." That shift is everything. It reclaims your power, piece by piece, from the hands of someone who couldn't handle it. When someone mistreats you, whether through lies, games, or emotional inconsistency, they create a wound. And the most dangerous part is that they often don't even notice the damage they've done until you heal, until you stop bleeding, until you stop reaching out, stop answering, stop making yourself available for their convenience. That's when the silence speaks loudest. Not because you're punishing them, but because you're protecting your peace. And when peace becomes your priority, everything that threatens it becomes irrelevant, including them. People always feel your absence differently when it's rooted in growth rather than bitterness. If you disappear in anger, they expect you to come back when the storm settles. But when you leave calmly, without drama, they feel the finality in it. That's what makes it real. That's what makes it sting. Because they can't argue with peace. They can't manipulate serenity. When they realize you've let go, not because you're trying to get a reaction, but because you genuinely want better for yourself, It challenges their ego in ways nothing else can. They start to wonder what changed, and the answer is you did. You woke up to your own value. You stopped overgiving. You stopped apologizing for your standards. You stopped settling for emotional crumbs and started asking yourself what you actually want. And then you went and built that life. The truth is, when someone thinks you'll always be there, they stop appreciating you. They take the security of your presence for granted. But when you leave, not in anger, but in evolution, you become the one that got away. Not because you vanished, but because you grew beyond the dynamic they kept you stuck in. You rise above the cycles, above the confusion, above the emotional tug-of-war. And you do it not with a performance, but with intention. You no longer play their games. You no longer bite the bait. You no longer let them back in just because they remembered how good you were. They start to feel the consequences of their actions in a way they never anticipated, not because you're punishing them, but because you've become unavailable to what doesn't serve you. You've stopped arguing. You've stopped explaining. You've stopped handing out chances like candy. And the irony? That's when they suddenly want back in. That's when the texts come, the apologies start, the old photos get liked. But by then, something deeper has shifted in you. You've tasted peace. You've started choosing yourself. And no apology, no breadcrumb trail, no last-minute effort can replace the comfort you've built in your own self-worth. What breaks them is not that you hated them, it's that you stopped needing them. It's that the person they once had access to is now a version of you they can't reach. Not because you're hiding, but because you've healed. You're not trying to make them jealous. You're not trying to win. You're just done. And that level of done, the kind that comes from inner work, reflection, and clarity, is something they can't undo. They can replay the past, they can regret their choices, but they can't go back because the person they were careless with no longer exists. You've become someone new, someone who learned, someone who grew, someone who finally realized that love should never require the loss of self. That realization changes everything. It's quiet, but it's unshakable. And when they feel that, when they see that, they finally understand what they lost. Not because you told them, but because your life tells the story. A life that is fuller, calmer, and entirely yours. That is the legacy of letting go with grace. That is the power they never saw coming. There is nothing more disarming than peace in the face of chaos, especially when someone expected you to fall apart. When a person cheats, manipulates, lies, or simply takes you for granted, they're often counting on your reaction. They expect you to cry, to beg, to explode in anger, or drown in self-blame. That reaction gives them control. It confirms their belief that they still matter, that they still have a hold on your emotions. But when you respond not with fury, but with silence and composure, when you meet the storm with calm, they start to panic. Because suddenly they're no longer the one in control, you are. There is something incredibly unsettling to someone who expected drama, but instead finds detachment. Your peace confuses them. It makes them question the power they thought they had over you. It forces them to look at themselves, perhaps for the first time, without the distraction of your emotional reaction to cover up their own guilt or insecurity. This is where the tables turn, not because you tried to manipulate anything, but because you chose peace over participation in a toxic cycle. You opted out of the performance, and that absence becomes louder than any confrontation could ever be. You have to understand, people who disrespect your boundaries don't expect you to enforce them. They rely on the fact that you care too much, that you'll keep coming back, that you'll be available for just one more conversation, one more explanation, one more round of emotional ping pong. But when you choose stillness, when you remove yourself without trying to explain or justify or make them see your worth, you take the power back. Not in a loud, vengeful way, but in a quiet, final one. And that kind of power can't be argued with. This kind of peace doesn't mean you feel nothing. It means you've stopped giving your energy to people who don't deserve it. You've stopped giving your tears to someone who doesn't value your joy. You've stopped trying to heal in the same environment that hurt you. And that decision to disengage, to breathe, to center yourself isn't weakness, it's strength. The kind of strength that doesn't need validation, the kind of strength that comes from knowing you don't need to convince anyone of your value because you've already convinced yourself. People often think peace is passive, but it's not. It's a decision. It's a daily practice. It's waking up and saying, today, I'm not going to chase closure. I'm not going to look at their social media. I'm not going to wait for the apology that may never come. I'm going to choose my well-being over the fantasy of who they could have been. That's what breaks them in the end, not your absence, not your silence, but the realization that they no longer have access to you, not because you're punishing them, but because you've outgrown the version of yourself who tolerated what they gave you. And maybe the most powerful part of this piece is that it's not performative. It's not for show. You're not doing it so they'll see you've moved on. You're doing it because you actually have, because you've stopped looking back, because you've started creating something better for yourself, and it feels too good to turn around. That kind of healing can't be faked. It's felt. And the people who hurt you can feel it too. Not because you throw it in their face, but because they can no longer feel your need for them. That emptiness, that lack of dependence, becomes the echo of everything they lost. You didn't get louder, you got quieter. And in doing so, you became untouchable. Not because you stopped caring about love, but because you started caring about the kind of love that doesn't require you to abandon yourself. That's what breaks them. When they realize they lost someone who was willing to give deeply, love bravely, and try wholeheartedly, but who now refuses to beg for the bare minimum. You didn't just walk away, you walked toward peace. And that, more than anything, is what they can't get back. When you choose peace, you choose yourself. And that choice is louder than any revenge, any perfectly worded message, any dramatic exit. Peace isn't passive, it's power wrapped in restraint. It's the decision to stop bleeding for someone who never brought a bandage. It's what makes him feel your absence in a way your presence never could. Because when you finally stop fighting to be seen and instead start protecting your energy, you become someone he can't reach. Not because you're hiding, but because you've risen. That's the quiet triumph. That's the real revenge. Not breaking down, but breaking free.